So up to this point, we've discussed what attitudes are and how we measure them. So in the second section, we'll discuss how and why attitudes form and introduce factors that influence attitude adjustment. Now, attitude formation is a complex process influenced by various factors, and it rarely happens in isolation. We develop our attitudes through a combination of direct experiences, social interactions, and exposure to information. One direct method of attitude formation is through association. So, just like Pavlov's dog learned to associate the sound of a bell with food, we often form attitudes based on the connections we make between objects, individuals, or concepts and our previous experiences or knowledge. For example, have you ever started liking a subject because you really liked the instructor, or perhaps developed a negative opinion about a particular type of food after a single bad experience? Another direct method is operant conditioning, where our behavior is influenced by the consequences that follow. If expressing a particular attitude is consistently rewarded, we're more likely to adopt and maintain it. Conversely, if we're punished for expressing a certain attitude, we're less likely to express it in the future. And then there are the indirect sources of information that can influence our attitudes. So, social learning theories proposed by Albert Bandura suggest that we learn by observing and modeling these behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. And so, if we see someone we admire expressing a certain attitude, we're more likely to adopt that attitude ourselves. Our culture and group norms also play a significant role in shaping our attitudes. We tend to conform to the attitudes and beliefs of our social groups and cultures to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. And these norms can become deeply ingrained in our social cognition over time. And finally, exposure to information from various sources, such as media, education, and personal conversations, can influence our attitudes. The framing and presentation of information can shape our perceptions and attitudes. And today, with the vast amount of information available through various media, both positive and negative attitudes are being formed constantly. But it's important to note that our attitudes are influenced by information from multiple sources, both direct and indirect, that shape our attitudes. However, direct experiences tend to have a stronger impact on our attitudes as compared to their counterpart. Nonetheless, indirect sources can also be influential, especially when they involve things like social pressure. Now, our attitudes are often initially established based on the first piece of information that we receive, but we modify and change them as we gain further information. So, attitude change refers to how and why our evaluations of the objects or ideas or people, why those shift over time. And they can change over time, becoming either stronger, weaker, or even opposite of what they were before. And this can be caused by direct experiences or indirect sources of information. So, the direct sources of information involve explicit, clear, and often persuasive messages that aim to change attitudes. These sources can include things like persuasive communication and personal experiences. And we'll discuss these more in detail in the next section. And there are also indirect sources, and these involve more subtle, often unconscious influences on attitudes. And these can include things like social influence, and we'll talk more about that come chapter 7. It also includes things like media advertising and classical conditioning, as we just mentioned. For instance, research by Stats in 1958 showed how pairing words with positive or negative stimuli could actually change attitudes towards those words. And beyond their development, attitudes serve several important functions in psychology, and they play a significant role in shaping human behavior and decision making. With value expressive function, attitudes can express and reinforce a person's core values and beliefs. When an attitude aligns with one's deeply held values, it provides a sense of moral or ethical consistency. For example, having a positive attitude towards volunteering reflects a value for community service and helping others. Individuals gain satisfaction by expressing attitudes that align with their personal values in this sense. The knowledge function suggests that attitudes can help individuals simplify and organize their understanding of the world. And this is based on the need to understand, make sense of, and give structure to the universe. By categorizing and evaluating objects, people, and ideas, attitudes allow individuals to make sense of their environment. For instance, having a positive attitude towards environmental conservation helps individuals categorize behaviors and decisions related to protecting the environment. So, for instance, having a positive attitude towards environmental conservation helps individuals to put those behavior and those decisions in the forefront. And of course, attitudes can serve an ego defensive function by protecting one's self esteem or self concept against the knowledge and acceptance of basic unpleasant truths about things like diseases or death or weakness, insecurity, frustration, unemployment, illness, and various other harsh realities of life. People may develop attitudes that defend against threats to their self worth or beliefs. For example, someone might develop a negative attitude towards a rival at work to protect their self esteem if they feel like that's their op. And so, up until this point, you may be curious as to why social psychologists are even interested in studying people's attitudes at all. Well, it's never just for face value, I assure you. But ultimately, the real power of attitudes lies in their ability to influence actions. And so, we study attitudes because they're generally good predictors of future behavior, but obviously not in isolation. Other factors such as subjective norms and perceived behavioral control can also influence behaviors. Our attitudes towards things like recycling, healthy eating, or even political candidates can shape our choices and behaviors in significant ways. But the relationship between attitudes and behavior isn't always straightforward. Sometimes our actions align perfectly with our attitudes, and other times they don't. And so, to understand this complex relationship, I urge you to take a look at this video on the theory of planned behavior. This theory provides a valuable framework for predicting behavior based on attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control. And so we'll recap what we've discussed here in this section too. We began by exploring the various ways attitudes are formed, including through association, which is classical conditioning, looking at rewards and punishment as operant conditioning, social learning, group cultural norms, and information exposure. These factors interact to shape our initial evaluations of people, objects, and ideas. But attitudes are not static because they change over time. And we discussed how direct experiences such as persuasive communication and personal encounters can lead to attitude adjustment. Additionally, indirect sources like social influence, media exposure, and even classical conditioning can subtly shape our evaluations. We have also examined the functions of attitudes, understanding why we hold them in the first place. Attitudes can serve a value expressive purpose, allowing us to express our values and gain social approval. They also help us to organize and interpret information as knowledge function, protect our self-esteem, which is the ego defensive function. And finally, we touched on the theory of planned behavior, which posits that our attitudes, along with subjective norms and perceived behavioral control, influence our intentions, which in turn predict our actual behavior. And this model highlights the complex interplay of factors that contribute to our actions. And so, by understanding how our attitudes are formed, how they change, and the purposes, as well as how they relate to behavior, we're beginning to gain insight into the dynamics of our thought and actions. And this provides a solid foundation for further exploration into these concepts. So, be sure to check into section 3 as we go into more detail about attitude change via the concept of persuasion.